has been, I would say, quite fair over the last, year and a half, because they realize if they don't accept the consumer proposal, the other option is bankruptcy.
Hey investors, Bradley here from Watson Estates, and you're listening to the largest and fastest growing podcast for Toronto real estate on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Thrilled you guys could join us as a broker investor myself. Want to know what's going on and share that info with you. That's exactly what we're going to do today as we talk to the king of bankruptcy trustees. We talk to Doug Hoyes. We have a great chat. I say the king because he actually holds a podcast himself called Debt Free in 30. It's a great show where you're going to learn how bankruptcy works. And you might be thinking, I'm an investor. What do I need to know about insolvency and bankruptcy? Well, you're going to realize by the end of the show, there's a lot of information, a lot of opportunities and question marks as it relates to our economy with what's going on in the real estate industry and where bankruptcies have or have not happened. Where are we going to find opportunities as investors? I know I was really excited to have this conversation and learn the dynamics. We really come at it from an angle of investors. We're not going to get into what happens if you fall into bankruptcy. Instead, we talk about how bankruptcy and the shift in bankruptcy in our marketplace is impacting your rental unit, is impacting the market as a whole, and what happens when interest rates rise, when this massive growth in equity ceases. This is what we talk about. We have a lot of fun as we do it. Please hit the like button. And if you haven't already subscribed, you can share this on Instagram. We grow organically because of the love and support you guys send us through sharing, and tag us at Watson Estates. Enjoy the show. Doug, thanks for joining us on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Bradley. Great to be here.
I'm very excited. We haven't had a bankruptcy trustee, and we've been looking far and wide for the guy. And I think you're the guy that's going to be able to speak to us today as investors, as Canadian investors, on what we need to know about bankruptcy, how this applies. I think there's a ton of reasons for us to chat. And but before we get going, maybe tell our audience a little bit about yourself. How do you spend your time apart from your podcasting? I know you can share your podcast as well. I think a lot of listeners would love it.
Yeah, so I am the co-founder of Hoyes, Michaelis and Associates Inc., which, as you said, is a consumer insolvency firm. My partner and I, Ted Michaelis, started it back in 1999. So we're 2.5 decades in, or whatever that is. And we focus on personal insolvency, so consumer proposals and bankruptcy. So someone's got more debt than they can handle, they come and see us. We're not restructuring corporations. I did do that for 10 years, working for the big accounting firms before starting this, but our focus is entirely on the individual. And you're right, we have a YouTube channel, but we've also got a podcast that I've been doing for a number of years now, Debt Free in 30, where we talk about these kind of issues that affect the average person. And so what we try to do is get as much information out there as possible. Bankruptcy is something you only deal with, hopefully, once in your life. It's not a recurring service. And it's the kind of thing, if you've never been involved in it before, you don't know where to turn, what to do. So we try to put as much information out there as we can so that people can make informed decisions.
And if for no other reason, our audience, who many of which are probably not in that situation right now, or they might be, we'll get into the numbers in a minute. Having had this conversation, hopefully they have a resource, or they see a resource in you, Doug, to be able to come out and start that conversation. How much does it cost? Actually, I was going to end with this, but just out of curiosity, how much does it cost for someone to come and speak with your firm about these types of things?
Well, it doesn't cost anything to speak with us. We are licensed insolvency trustees, licensed and regulated by the federal government. And one of the conditions of our license is there are no upfront fees. So if you're on the internet and you're finding somebody who's going to charge you any money at all upfront, then they're not reputable. It's as simple as that. We are not allowed to charge upfront fees. So in a typical scenario, in a bankruptcy, the amount of money you pay while you're bankrupt is based on your income and your assets. So there's a grid that the government uses. Most of the time, 75% of the time, we're filing a consumer proposal as opposed to a bankruptcy, which is a deal that gets worked out with the creditors. So our typical client might owe $50,000 or $60,000 in unsecured debt, credit cards, bank loans, that sort of thing. And we would go to the creditors and say, hey, how about we do a proposal where we pay back $18,000, $300 a month for 5 years would be a typical proposal that we would do. And our fee, which is set by the government, comes out of that $300 every month. So that's how we get paid when we're helping a client.
So, I mean, we're talking about bankruptcy, but obviously insolvency seems to be the bigger thing. And is that, those are real numbers? Those are the types of numbers you're seeing right now. Have you noticed any trends upward or downward on what creditors are willing to accept? Maybe this is an indication of the kind of pressure that they're under today during COVID.
Yeah, it's a great question. And since the pandemic started, creditors have been more willing to make deals. So CRA, for example, has been, I would say, quite fair over the last year and a half, because they realize if they don't accept the consumer proposal, the other option is bankruptcy. And in virtually all cases, they're getting less in a bankruptcy than they're going to get in a consumer proposal. So we would crunch the numbers, and if based on your income, assets, whatever, maybe a bankruptcy would cost you $10,000, well, we might offer a proposal of $12,000 where you're paying $200 a month over a 5-year period. So from a creditor's point of view, well, I'd rather get all my money, but if that's not one of my choices, I would rather get as much as I can, which is where the consumer proposal becomes a pretty good option. And we have seen pretty much all of the creditors, the big banks, CRA, other lenders, credit card companies, and so on, agreeing with that philosophy. Yeah, we would rather get something rather than nothing now, or rather than less. Now, I don't know what the world's going to look like 6 months from now. If the economy snaps back and everything's going great, then maybe creditors will be a little bit more aggressive. But at the moment, yes, they are willing to look at and in most cases accept any reasonable proposal.
Yeah. Now, Doug, you don't know this. We actually had a podcast. I've had a guest on our show a couple times now that has showed us the numbers saying the power of sale, so specific to the power of sale space, is very much down. Those numbers seem to be very low. I know you guys publish your own report. Tell us a little bit about that report, what you're seeing as far as homeowners that are declaring bankruptcy. Is this a homeowner problem, or is this a tenant only or a renter problem? What do the numbers show us as far as your report?
Yeah, so we published the Hoyes Michaelis Homeowners Bankruptcy Index. I came up with that name myself, so it's a pretty good name, I thought.
It rolls off the tongue.
There you go. And what it is the percentage of our clients who own a home at the time they file their consumer proposal or bankruptcy. So if you go back to like 2011, it was about a third of our clients, because back then real estate market wasn't that frothy. Maybe I owned a house, maybe I had a few $1,000s worth of equity in it, but my debts were a lot more than that. I could file a bankruptcy or a consumer proposal, contribute the equity back into the process, not lose my house. It was no big deal. Since then, that number has dropped, and currently we are very close to zero. I mean, over the last few months, it's hovered between 0 and 4% of our clients. So it's essentially nobody, and that makes perfect sense. If you bought a house 2, 3, 4, or 5 years ago, almost for sure it is worth a lot more than when you paid for it. I mean, I guess there would be isolated places where, I don't know, maybe you bought a house in Fort McMurray or something and it's gone down in value, but pretty much anywhere in Ontario, it's over the last 5, 6, 7 years, what has it doubled? I mean, it's certainly worth a lot more. So even if you got laid off during the pandemic, your income dropped, you had to use credit cards to survive, and now you owe $50,000 on your credit card and your line of credit, well, you can probably go and increase your mortgage, get a secured line of credit, get a HELOC, or sell your house and generate more than enough money to cover those unsecured debts. So homeowners for the last few years have not been going bankrupt, have not been filing a consumer proposal. It's a little bit different if you get into the upper end of the province. If you go to, North Bay, Rainy River, places like that, where the real estate market hasn't accelerated anywhere near as much, but certainly in Southern Ontario, the Toronto region, the GTA, Kitchener, Windsor, London, Ottawa, virtually nobody who owns a house has been filing an insolvency.
Yeah. So first off, very interesting. And guys, I know many of our listeners, just from the demographics, are probably not facing, based on these numbers, bankruptcy. But this obviously creates where there's some people who have high risk and are getting pounded by these types of things. There's also opportunities. And I think that those opportunities are found very much in homeowners. I would assume that would be the case. But at the same time, so what ends up happening is, just like I think, from how I see it, and hopefully this comes out in our conversation, there's a push down. People who are owning homes are being forced into rentals. People who are rentals pushed into affordable housing. It almost seems like that kind of middle class squeeze has happened between home ownership or real estate owners versus those who don't own properties. But within that, there's a tension in that relationship that I think we're seeing from, and maybe you can kind of voice your thoughts on this, that happens further out you go from the major core. So even in Southern Ontario, I would expect, even from my portfolio and what I see out there, that there's a difference between folks in Toronto proper versus folks out in even Windsor, right? Further out in these communities. So what is that dynamic? How has that shifted over the last little while?
Yeah, you're right. And I have offices throughout the province, from Windsor in the west to Ottawa in the east, and all points in between. So yeah, we do see a lot of regional variation. When prior to the pandemic, real estate condos, for example, as you know, were very hot in Toronto. And then the pandemic happened, and it's like, well, if I'm working remotely, do I want to be in a 500 square foot condo that I can't leave, or would I rather go stay with my parents in London where they've got a yard and I can at least go out and walk the dog? So we saw a mass exodus from the downtown core. And obviously things like Airbnb, which is a massive component of the downtown Toronto market, sort of disappeared for a while because nobody was traveling. So we saw that shift. Now, is it going to gradually start coming back? I don't know. I mean, every time I go to my office at Yonge and King, which is the definition of downtown Toronto, it still seems to me to be largely deserted. Our building, which is a 20-story building, it's still largely empty. So I don't know what's going to happen with people returning to the city. Obviously, the easing of restrictions will make that much more prevalent. But you hit on a very interesting point, which is the middle class. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is there isn't one anymore. So when the pandemic started, obviously we had CERB in 2020, and then we had CRB in 2021, and most of those government supports now have pretty much ended. But if you were working as a server in a restaurant, bringing home, $1,500 a month, a couple of grand a month, when CERB came in, you were now getting $2,000 a month, and you didn't have to spend money on transit and clothes and everything to get to work. Your situation improved slightly. And if you were a knowledge worker working in one of the big towers in downtown Toronto, but you lived in Mississauga or Barrie or Oshawa, hey, this was great. Now I can stay home. I don't have the commuting costs, don't have to pay for parking and the GO train. I don't have to pay for childcare because I don't have before and after school drop-offs and everything, but I'm still getting paid the same amount of money. Boom, things were way better for those people. Obviously, anybody who owned real estate over the last couple of years has benefited. The people in the middle are the ones who've kind of gotten screwed. So if I was working at a server at a restaurant and I was bringing in $3,000 a month between salary and tips, or working at a hair salon or a gym, and my income all of a sudden went to $2,000 or less, I really got hammered. And that's what we're seeing. The rich did fine. The people at the very lowest income end pretty much did fine, but it's that middle that got completely hollowed out. And if they happen to be one of your tenants in your rental property, I know, because a lot of them are my clients, and they had to call up their landlord and say, look, I cannot make the rent payment this month. I can't make the full rent payment this month. This is why. So a lot of landlords have been very good. They've said, okay, well, we'll work with you. We'll do whatever we can. But that's been, I think, the biggest impact on landlords during the whole events of the last 2 years.
So let's dive into that environment. And maybe along the way, you can tell us what your thoughts are on having a tenant with bad credit. And maybe I know for myself, I can often probably be hard on someone that has bad credit, but I'd love to hear your take on that. But I definitely want to dive into the situation that we're seeing where rents on some of our properties and just going, and this is on the outskirts of the GTA, have literally doubled from a lot of these folks that have been renting for 4 or 5 years. And I do notice this shift right now where the majority of tenants approaching us on our vacant units the primary reason seems to be my landlord is selling. What can you tell us about this transition? Because we know right now landlords are the most active buyer group. We see 1 in 4 buyers being investors, but there's not so much talk about investors selling in order to get around the noose that is the Ontario Landlord Tenant Board. So tell
Right.
us a little bit about of what you're seeing on that front.
So my typical client has take-home pay of around $2,600 a month. And obviously it'd be higher in the GTA than it is in, Windsor or outside the GTA. But think about that for a minute. So $2,600 a month, how much does it cost to rent a condo in downtown Toronto? Well, there's lots of condos for rent for $2,000 a month, right? How is it possible if you're bringing in $2,600 a month to rent a condo? So you've either got to have a roommate or a spouse or something like that. That's where the pressure comes in. If you've been living in that condo for 10 years, you may only be paying, I don't know, $1,000, $1,200, $1,400, $1,500 a month. If I'm the landlord and it's like, well, boy, I could be renting this place for $2,500 a month, easy. What do I do? Well, I guess one option is I put the place up for sale, I sell it, I just buy another unit in the same building, and now I've managed to eliminate my tenant.
Right.
The other way it happens is through renoviction. Well, I'm going to renovate the apartment, so I need you out. Or I'm going to put my family member in there. My mother's going to come live in the condo. I need you out. So you're gone. I put my mother in there for one day. My mother decides she doesn't want to live there anymore. And now I can rent the condo out at market rates again because there's nobody in the building or nobody in the unit. So that's the investor perspective, but the impact on the person renting is my rent just went way up. And often that is the final straw that breaks the camel's back because I was just barely keeping up with my debts and now my rent has been jacked right up. So now what do? Well, I find myself in an insolvency situation. Now, I will say that a lot of landlords have been very accommodating during this period because I think a seasoned landlord understands the value of a good tenant. If you have to kick a tenant out, if you have to clean up the place and it takes 2 months for a new tenant to come in, you just lost 2 months worth of rent. That's a significant number. So keeping a good tenant is usually a good thing, but that's the pressure we've got. And I see it from both sides. If I'm a landlord and my property taxes keep going up, my hydro, condo fees, whatever keep going up, I want to recoup as much of that as possible. I can only raise rents by a certain amount. I'm going to look for ways to recoup those losses or at least take advantage of the huge benefit that the real estate rising has accrued.
And so what I also see, those are all fantastic points. As I'm thinking through what you're saying here, what I'm also seeing is a lot of units that are coming up for sale with legacy tenants, where the rate of return on those properties that are being listed are junk, in fact, negative. But the pursuit and the love and ultimate eventual increasing of those rent rates is calling investors to still purchase those properties. So the buyer pool is still very, very high. And unfortunately, as much as there's a lot of good landlords and nice landlords, the success in this environment favors the one that's aggressive and will push those tenants out in order to get that cap rate up and in order to actually obtain the true value of that property, which is found in the rents. So there's this kind of tension that's happening where you kind of hope people play nice, but if you're going to play nice, you have to be very picky. And often the people who are selling, it's being done for financial reasons. Generally, people in this climate don't want to sell. Real estate investors don't want to sell. They're selling because of the opportunity cost of holding that low tenant. So just to quickly move on with this topic as well, what is your perspective on someone who has bad credit? Would you say if you were to, as a landlord, look at the tenant pool, and there's obviously a lot of the assumption here is there's a ton of tenants looking right now. So we can be picky, but would you put a favor towards the bad credit individual because of where that stands on that list of what we should be looking for? Do you find does bad credit equate to lack of payment, I guess is the question, or can people be in a sincere scenario where that won't happen?
Well, sometimes it's the exact opposite. So what you have to do, I'm not a big fan of looking at one metric. I like to look at a bunch of stuff. So if I said to you, oh, that guy over there weighs 180 pounds and that guy over there weighs 250 pounds. Okay, what does that tell you?
Right.
Nothing. Tells you nothing at all, right? Because, well, one guy's a football player and the other guy's sedentary and he should be weighing less than that, kind of a thing. So you need to know a whole bunch more stuff. If I say to you someone's credit score is X versus Y, well, okay, that's one metric, but what's the rest of the story? So it's very common that someone gets into financial trouble because they lose their job. Company goes under, they get laid off, whatever, they use credit to survive. So their credit score goes down. They need to relocate to a different city for a job, or they need to find a cheaper place to live, or their landlord is selling the place, they need to find another place. So they apply to rent the apartment that you are renting. So you do a credit check on them and you go, oh, your credit score is low. Well, what are the other factors? If that person has recently filed a consumer proposal or a bankruptcy, their credit score will be low. It's absolutely right. But by filing that procedure, they have effectively eliminated all their debts, which means they are not paying out all that money to service their debt, which means they've got a lot more free cash flow to be paying rent. So if the person has a job, has first and last month's rent, then to me, that is probably a better tenant long-term than the guy who has $75,000 worth of credit card debt, and every month he borrows from one to pay off the other, plays the game, makes sure his credit score stays really high, but he's got a mountain of debt. So just looking at purely the credit score does not give you the full picture. A credit score is something created for the benefit of the lender, not for the borrower. A lender wants to know that you're a good credit risk. And so somebody who carries a balance on their credit cards but makes the minimum payment every month is a great credit risk because we're making lots of interest on them. And as a result, they get rewarded with a high credit score. I would kind of prefer a tenant with their debt under control and are able to make those payments. So if I was a property manager, which I'm not, then I would be asking a bunch of questions. So yes, I'd like to see your credit report. But I would also like to know, do you have a job? What's your situation? What did your old landlord say? Like, can you get a letter of recommendation from your old landlord? Because if your old landlord liked you, but was selling the place and had to get rid of you, that tells me a lot. If your old landlord didn't like you as much, okay, what was the reason for that? So I would be looking at a bunch of different factors when making that decision. Obviously, if you have 1,000 tenants lined up to rent your place, you've got your pick. You can look at whoever you want. But let's face it, how many multimillionaires are going to rent that unit you've got up for rent? I don't know, none, because they're just going to buy the whole building then if they're that rich. So the person who is a renter, almost by definition, doesn't have a whole pile of cash, or else they'd be an owner. So you can't expect everyone to be Warren Buffett when they come and rent your place. So I'd be looking at a bunch of other factors as well to make that decision. The credit score alone is not the only metric I'd be looking at.
So I hear those things, and we're not going to create a niche of bankruptcy tenant. Imagine if that was your niche, like this, I'm the landlord of the bankrupt. But we do see pressure right now from people who are essentially losing their home from circumstances. We'll talk about those in a second, but just to speak to this, we just recently in the Niagara region had a 2-bedroom listed on Facebook. We've had over 1,800 people look at that unit. So as far as competition goes, there's a ton of competition, and the quote unquote renter, the legacy renters, they don't make the cut. Those typical, the ones that you kind of view as this is what a renter looks like, they're building their credit. There's not a lot of room for those folks anymore, because now what we have is individuals who have owned real estate. So now I want to let's move up the ladder, because I think what we're seeing is this flow from those folks to come into the rental space and really knocking a lot of them out. Is let's have an individual who owns their property. Their values have gone up a lot, but because of maybe things like the stress test, right now you no longer qualify for a mortgage, or maybe there is lost income or some factor that's forcing you to retire sooner. Those individuals are getting kind of sprinkled. I'm curious, do they how does that work on an insolvency standpoint? Because my understanding is they wouldn't even qualify if they've got this kind of pool of money sitting there, where their option, it seems, is to sell themselves and to move. So what, for that individual, that kind of, let's say, lower middle class that's getting pushed into the lower class, what does that situation look for as far as bankruptcy or consumer proposals?
Yeah, and what you've described is someone who perhaps has owned a home for many years, and you're right, for, kids are grown, I'm downsizing, don't really want to own anymore. I've been in Toronto, but I'm retiring. Hey, why not move out to the Niagara region where I can, be where all the wineries are, and it'll be great. In that particular case, that person probably doesn't have a mountain of debt. Right. And even if they do, well, when they sell their house, they're going to have a ton of cash. They can pay off their credit card. So that's not the person who's coming to see me. And you're right. If I'm a landlord, then, hey, that sounds like a great tenant. They're going to have no problem coming up with first and last month's rent. Obviously, you would have questions about what their income going forward is. But yes, if that's the competition for somebody who is in a less good financial situation, then you're right. That person has certainly got an advantage. We haven't seen, I don't see any of those people because they don't have debt, and as a result, they're not coming to me for the solution. Now, will I start to see those people over the next year or two? That's a very interesting question. I have no clue what the real estate market's going to do. So I have no idea. But, if you believe the news, interest rates are on the way up.
Right.
Okay. So what impact will that have on everything? Again, I'm not an expert. I don't know. You would know more than I. But if I'm paying a 3% rate on my mortgage now, and interest rates go up by 1%, now I'm paying 4%. And people would go, well, 1%, one's a very small number. It's not a big deal. No, it went from 3 to 4. That's a third. That's 1 over 3. That's a 33% increase if it's a variable rate mortgage on what you're paying each month. So it is possible that people who have equity in their houses but are constrained on the income side, and let's face it, a lot of people have variable rate mortgages, they could start to feel some of that pressure. And those are the people who you just described who may say, you know what, I've got a lot of cash locked in. Why don't I sell now? I can rent and I don't need to own anymore. I don't need the hassles of home ownership. Those are the people who I think will be sprinkled down. What I also don't know, and again, you would know better than I, is what is the supply side of it? Are there a lot of units coming online over the next year or two? Because obviously that will affect the balance as well.
Right. So it's interesting to see how that all, I guess my question there is how many people are being forced to sell as their only option because they don't have the qualifications for insolvency. But to kind of speak to where you're going here is, what do you see as far as future? Like, we have interest rates as one aspect, but maybe if the market were to come down, have you seen historically when the market comes down that we see an increase in the number of bankruptcies? How does the bankruptcy space follow the real estate housing market generally when we look over the last 20, 30 years or since you've started?
Yeah, I would say it's highly correlated. What is the only industry in Canada? Real estate. Like, what else do we do here? What products do we make here? We are a real estate nation. That is our number one savings vehicle. It's not the stock market. It's not crypto. It's real estate. So if real estate does start to, stop going up, then yes, it will have a significant impact on the rate of insolvency. So we've just come through a pandemic. Everybody was locked down. A lot of people not working. What was the impact on the rate of bankruptcy filings in Canada? Did it go way up because nobody was working? Nobody had any money? Nope, the exact opposite. Personal insolvencies right now, late winter, early spring of 2022, are at their lowest level in 20 years. Where is the real estate market? Well, certainly at its highest level in forever.
So you see that on the up, but you see that as well on the down from where you were sitting. Yes.
Yeah, because so let's say I'm a real estate investor. I buy a condo, I'm renting it out. So, and you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong on what I'm about to say, because I may be totally wrong on this, but the typical guy or girl who goes out, buys a condo and rents it out is cash flow negative, are they not?
Today, they absolutely are. Absolutely.
So what kind of investment is cash flow negative? I buy this bond and I have to pay interest every month. Like it makes no sense. And the answer is, well, yeah, I have to put in $500 a month to the condo over and above what I'm getting in rent, but it's going up by $1,000 a month.
I see you. Yeah.
How do I cash in? I have to sell. That's the only way.
So what you're saying is in that scenario, you have even investors that are on the edge, where right now we've got a landslide on top of renters. But if we were to see a market downturn, all of those who think they're immortal right now would end up feeling the pressure if they've purchased investments that aren't long-term or in some kind of fixed scenario that protects them from fluctuation.
Right. If you're an investor and you put 50% cash down, then you're fine. Your property is cash flow positive, you're good. But if you took the equity from your first property, put 5% down on the next one, and then put 5% down on the next one after that, so long as prices keep going up, you're fine. But even if prices stop going up, they don't have to crash. They just have to stop going up. Where all of a sudden it's like, okay, I've got to come up with a couple of $1,000s every month to service my 4 or 5 properties. Where am I getting that couple of $1,000s from? I can't keep increasing the mortgages, getting a bigger HELOC if prices have stalled. And if interest rates are going up, even just a tiny bit, then that obviously affects the debt service as well. So to answer your question, can I envision a scenario where in the future we have an increase in insolvencies as a result of real estate stopping going up or even coming down? Yeah, absolutely. I have no idea how many people are over levered, but again, correct me if I'm wrong, a significant number of the people buying, let's say, condos in Toronto are investors, not end users. Is that correct?
So for fun, I can't speak specific to condos, but actually I can speak specific to condos. Investors buy condos generally more than low-rise units, but we see a massive increase. They're the only category of buyers that has increased in the last few years. Investors. Every other category, first-time home buyers included, have started to go down. Yeah. So here to kind of wrap this up, and you've segued perfectly. What are your thoughts on leverage and holding a mortgage? Because you're obviously your entire profession is based off of debt and consolidation and helping people get away from it. Do you hate debt, or what does that look like in your field and in your mind?
Well, yes, I am biased against debt, but obviously anybody who levered themselves right up to the hilt over the last 10 years and bought a house that was far too big and far too expensive and a condo that was crazily overpriced, they've done fantastic. So what really matters is the future. So I'll tell you a real estate story. 1987, the market I'm going back a few years here now, well before you were born. 1987, the market was going up, up, up. In 1989, it looked like it was rolling over. So I bought a townhouse up in the Markham area. I paid $205,000 for it. And I thought I was getting a great deal because in that complex, somebody the year before had paid $275,000 for basically the same unit. So I bought the unit and I lived there for 7 years. And when I sold it 7 years later, I sold it for $20,000 less than I paid for it. So I held something for 7 years and lost 20 grand. Now, nobody can tell that story in the last 10 or 20 years. But if you go back far enough, that's what happens. So I think if I'm an investor, I have to look back in history and say, you know what, things cannot always keep going up forever. House prices, real estate prices can't keep going up by 20% a year, every year, every year, every year. I mean, we're going to mathematically get to the point where a 1-bedroom, bachelor apartment in Toronto is $3 million. How much rent would you have to charge on that unit? Well, are wages going up by the same amount? No, not even close. In fact, wage growth is negative in real terms now when you factor out inflation. So I think my answer to the leverage question is, yes, look at the positive aspects, but also put your own stress test on it and ask yourself, what would happen if interest rates went up by half a point, 1 point? What would happen if prices leveled off? What would happen if prices went down by 5 or 10%? What would happen if they went down by 40%? Do I have the excess cash to be able to fund whatever would happen in that circumstance? If you do, great, fantastic. Real estate as a long-term investment, I mean, I don't think there's been a 20-year period in Canadian history where it hasn't been a good idea. But is there a 2-year period where it's been down, or a 5-year period? Yeah. So what is your time horizon? How much risk are you willing to take? And then, decide based on that.
From a market perspective, we're nearing into March when we're uploading, or we're recording this at the end of February. But when this podcast gets uploaded, we are, as Canadians, coming to a bit of a fork in the road where there is big decisions being made on interest rates. And in my opinion, a high likelihood of at least a slowdown in market prices. And so this is very interesting to get your take. And I'm curious, actually, one more question. Now, the power of sales space, there is limits on how much can be processed. Do those limits exist? So let's say we get this massive influx of insolvencies and bankruptcies. Is there a system behind the scenes that will bottleneck that? Or is there an opportunity for all of these insolvencies to happen simultaneously? I'm curious, because that's what we see happening in that space.
Yeah, I mean, our business and all of my competitors who do this, we're fairly scalable. So if my volume was to increase 20% next month, I'd be able to handle it. I mean, if it kept increasing at that rate, obviously I'd have to bring on more staff and things like that. But because we've had such a drop in the rate of insolvency over the last couple of years, most insolvency firms have lots of staff. So we could certainly handle the uptick. Now, what you're referring to also is things like power of sales and foreclosures. And obviously there's a court process involved with that. There's some complexities to that. The court process in general has been somewhat backlogged over the last couple of years because, well, here in Ontario, most court hearings are being done exactly the way we're talking today, over Zoom. So that has kind of gummed up the works. The court system is not easy to instantly implement new technology and get with the time. So it's taken them a while. So I would expect that if we do have some kind of pullback like that, it will take a while for foreclosures and powers of sales to catch up to what's happening. It won't be quick.
Guys, now you can see why I brought Doug on the show. This has been a really very good conversation. Doug, tell us a little bit about your podcast, where people can find you on social. I know you got a lot going on apart from joining us today. Tell us where people are best to connect with you and what you're doing.
Well, our main company website is hoyes.com, HOYES.com. The podcast is debt-free in 30, so you can go to YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever. We're everywhere. Twitter, I'm at Doug Hoyes, just my name, DOUGHOYES. I don't post a huge amount on Twitter because I find it creepy. Like, it's just whatever you say, 12 people or 1,000 people are going to jump on you. So even me making the comment today that real estate prices could theoretically not keep going up forever, I'm sure you'll get lots of hate mail on that. But I've always been one to tell it like it is. Here's what I'm seeing, and we'll let the facts decide what ultimately happens. But I agree with you. The next few months will definitely be interesting.
Dude, there's no hate coming from our audience. We're thrilled that you've taken some time to go into some hypotheticals with us. Guys, please support this show. Hit the like button, subscribe to our podcast. And you can also share the episode, tag us at Watson Estates. But Doug, really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks very much.